Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey everybody, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with story, we celebrate creativity, and we love to talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University. I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. I write books. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. But as I like to say, I've created a life where I get to be around and always inspired by interesting people. So this podcast is my sandbox where I take every opportunity to be further inspired and learn from amazing people. So I always mean it when I say today's special guest is, but today's special guest is not only one of my favorite contemporary authors, one of my favorite all-around people, MVP literary citizen, and not least my dad's favorite writer, Louis Bayard. Let me give the brief version of a very long bio. In the words of the New York Times, Louis Bayard reinvigorates historical fiction, rendering the past as if he witnessed it firsthand. True dat. His acclaimed novels include The Pale Blue Eye, which you might have heard was adapted into a global #1 Netflix release starring Christian Bale. Jackie and Me, ranked by the Washington Post as one of their top novels of 2022. The national bestsellers Courting Mr. Lincoln, Roosevelt's Beast, The School of Night, The Black Tower, and more. His reviews and articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and Salon. He's a contributing writer to the Washington Post book world, and his new release, The Wildes, is predictably making everybody happy, not the least me. Lou, I'm very happy to see you. As always, I'm delighted for you joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Sean. It's always great to chat with you.
Well, it really is like it's an honor and a pleasure. And I'm giddy because again, like it's not often that you really do get to chat with amazing writers whose work you know will endure. And you're like, I get to talk to these people while they're here. So let's just get right down to it. I'll say later, no suspense. I loved it. I knew I'd love it. But you are in the glow and in kind of mid-book tour, post-release, the golden glow. How is it going, and how are you feeling about everything?
It's going well, I guess. I mean, it's sort of weird. You know, you send a book out into the world and you cease to have any control over it. You're going around the world and you're talking about, not the world, excuse me. I didn't get as far as Kansas City, but I've been in a little bit of a book tour, and you talk about it, and people review it, but it's completely out of your control once it gets published. So there's an interesting feeling of, I don't know, helplessness about it. You know, your boy has graduated from college and going out into the land, and you just hope there are some welcoming homes out there. But no, I've been getting some lovely responses like yours, and that's all a guy can ask for, I think.
Yeah, and I think right, you've done this long enough and successfully enough. I think even going back to like our college days, there's just something there's a natural cycle of the anxiety, the buildup, the work, but then there's something liberating and a little depressing about you let go of it. I think you articulate wonderfully. It's like you really do cease to control. And I think that there's that beautiful balance where you respect your readers. So it's like you give it to them and they own it. But there has to be that tremendous pride of accomplishment every time you put one out.
Pride, or maybe it's just relief that somehow it's done. I work really well on deadlines for that reason, but they create a certain, as you know, a certain amount of anxiety. So I'm just happy at the end, in the end, that it's done. But I'm also trying to feel good about what I've done. So
Yes.
that's the goal. You get it done, and it feels good, or it feels all right, or it feels ready to go at some
Yeah.
point.
Well, I will be accused probably, and I'm fine with it, of being too much of a fanboy. But I for people that don't know you yet, I just, I want to impress upon them anyone that's been doing this for a long time that is productive, that gets the work done, can be held up. in an increasingly chaotic world. The literary landscape is not getting any easier. Anyone that does the work should be celebrated, but you do the work consistently. I always want to make special note of the fact that you are a literary machine. And the question everyone wants to know is, how do you do it?
Well, I have two really expensive kids, so that's part of it. I need to be paid. I need someone to pay me so I can afford these kids of mine. I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I guess I'm naturally disciplined about this stuff. I'm not organized about anything else in my life. I'm completely absent-minded about everything else. But when it
Yeah,
comes to my work, I get very, very tunneled in at some point. So I just sit down every day and do it, which I know you do too. And I
yeah,
would guess most writers, the ones who are getting published are the ones who really just hunker down and get it done. It's our job to get it done. So I try to treat it
yeah,
like a job and take it seriously, but also I guess, step away for a few hours at night just to clear my head. But
yeah,
yeah, I'm just working as hard as I can. And also I would add that I'm 60 now. So if anything, I feel more urgent about my work because I don't know how much mental life I have left. Both my parents had dementia starting in their 70s. So that imparts a certain urgency to what I'm doing. I figure, okay, I don't know how much longer I get to tell my stories. So that
yeah.
makes each book kind of a bigger deal in some ways because who knows if this will be the last.
Sure. And I think, there's no fake humility there. I was talking to Disha Filia recently, and she mentioned how, and she put it much better than I will now, but despite her unbelievable, hurricane of good news and good tidings
Right.
and the release, she's like basically said what you said in a different way, which is I'm not, in my 30s or even 40. Like there's a purposeful and positive, but there's a sense of urgency. I think I had asked her, have you been able to kind of slow down and soak it in? And she's like, yeah, but I recognize this is an opportunity for me to do what I want to do. So there are so many writers that spend their lives trying to get there.
Mm,
How dare I not take advantage and be as productive as I can be? And I think that that's wonderful to hear. Kind of in our social
yeah.
media hellscape where everyone's a brand. Like the work itself has to be the reward.
Yeah.
But I also think, and you kind of mentioned, like I think writers kind of they to have that control because they recognize keenly that the world is crazy and not getting any less crazy. So our projects give us that opportunity to create little messes and clean them up and make our lists, and then we can instill some order in a world that doesn't have a lot
Yeah.
of order.
Oh yeah, you're right. This is the part of the world we control. That the only part maybe that we can control is our own work. I love what Disha said because it gets to the gratitude. I try to be in the gratitude business as much as I can because if you get a place at the table of publishing, even if it's a small place, you should count yourself lucky to be there. It's a hard business to get into, a hard business to stay in, a hard business to stay relevant in. So the fact that I'm still at the table is something that I'm very grateful for, and I never uh, take for granted. So
Right.
it sounds like she feels the same way.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say so not only all of that, but it seems to me, and I certainly wouldn't want to try to rank your books, but you you consistently are setting new challenges. And we can I ticked off some of them, but like um some of the historical figures you've tackled range from Lincoln and Poe to Jackie Kennedy and Teddy Roosevelt. But I can't be the only fan who, when I first heard of your then forthcoming project being about Oscar Wilde, I was like, all of the ones I mentioned, like they all make sense and you made them make sense, like full stop. But I was like, this is perfect that he's going to go after Oscar Wilde. I'm curious, how long have you wanted to write about Oscar or talk about the origins of not only the
Yeah.
book, but your fascination with his life? Because obviously, for those that don't know, we know him as the witty raconteur who wrote brilliant works, but his life was art too. So there's a lot there to unpack.
There sure is. And it's funny when you talk about people, when people found out the subject of my book, I got more than a few remarks along the lines of, well, that takes a lot of balls to write about the wittiest,
Oh,
figure of Western literature. Try to portray him and try to even approach the level of his wit and brilliance. Um, so yeah, I mean, for me, I always it was the same when I was writing about uh, Tiny Tim. I never felt like I was trying to compete with Dickens. I'm just trying to collaborate in a weird way, involuntary on the part of Dickens and Wilde. But so I just see it as a form of homage, and I think all my books are a form of homage to somebody. In my own head, Jackie and Me, for instance, is my Edith Wharton novel, and Lincoln, the Lincoln book, is my Henry James novel. But in my head, they don't necessarily come out that way on the page. So Oscar, and I don't know, I've known about Oscar all my life. I think he's
Right.
part of that kind of welcome kit you get when you come out as a gay man in our world. You know, here's Oscar Wilde, here's the Golden Girls reruns. You know, it's that whole kind of litany of stuff.
Right.
And so certainly the part of that continuum, but I think he's this figure we're all aware of at some level, subliminally or frontally, whatever. But I would say that a couple of things. And there was a film that came out in 1997, I think, called Wilde. It's a biopic of him, starring the magnificent Stephen Fry, who is perfectly cast, perfectly cast. And it's a
Yeah.
great portrait of Oscar. It's a great portrait of his love affair with Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas. But Constance in that movie, his wife, is just this very tangential figure. She's played by Jennifer Ailey, a wonderful actress, but she has nothing to do. And I remember staring at this movie, wondering, okay, who is this woman? What kind of woman would marry Oscar Wilde? What kind of woman would Oscar Wilde marry? And so even then, 1997, I was like, I wanted to learn more about her.
Yeah.
And then I guess a few years ago, there came out a biography of her written by Franny Moyle. I don't know if it was published in America, but it definitely had some play in England. And the more I learned about her, I thought, well, this woman's kind of fascinating. She was a feminist, she was a progressive, very intelligent, multilingual, very accomplished young woman when she married Oscar. And their marriage really was a marriage of equals. You know, he was feminist in his own way. So the more I learned about it, it's like, wow, there's somebody needs to tell this story. And then, of course, I read about the boys who had very sad lives of their own.
Yeah.
And I realized there's really no fictional rendering of what happened to Oscar's family. I should add, when you tell people that you're writing a book about Oscar Wilde's family, 9 times out of 10, they didn't even know he had one. And I think that's because he's come down to us as this gay martyr of the Victorian era.
Yeah.
So the book is a kind of outing of him as family man, which was very important to him.
Yep. Well put. And yeah, I mean, so I can't like overstate the high wire artistically that you decided to go on, which is again tackling the wittiest writer in the English language, arguably,
Mhm.
but really saying that would be enough of a challenge and enough catnip for your fans. But to really in a book, it's a novel in 5 acts. The 5 acts do take kind of an equal look at kind of the ripple effects of a particular summer and how that really shaped all of these lives. Oscar's certainly,
Mhm.
his lover, I won't even soulmate. Well, so I want to hear a little bit about that, but I think the bigger question, because I deliberately don't want to ask questions that everyone would ask, because I think they need to read the book to just answer them themselves. But suffice it to say, you get inside the heads of all of these characters to varying degrees. What was the most challenging? What surprised you?
Hmm.
Talk about your. Let's get crafty.
Crafty. Sure. Well, I think one of the things I realized early on, see, when I wrote Courting Mr. Lincoln, I knew that Lincoln would have to be the mystery in that because he was a mystery to people even while he was alive. So he's the one of the three characters who doesn't have his own close third. He's the only one who doesn't have his own POV because I thought it was important to see him from the outside and see people trying to figure out who he what really was,
Right.
what he was feeling and thinking. The same with Oscar. I thought it's part of that. You know, how dare you try to compete with Oscar? I thought if I can observe him from the outside and see him the way other people saw him, then that could work. So the really, in my mind, the protagonist of the book is Constance. She is the POV that we get through the bulk of it, and I consider it really her story in a way. And I think that's what makes it the book a little different than other treatments of Oscar because it's coming at him through the perspective of his family. But the 5 act structure came because, well, it began with the fact that when I was contemplating writing this novel, the what happened to everybody was so damn depressing that I didn't know if I wanted to live in that for 2 years, which takes me 2 years usually to push a book into the world. So that, but then I started looking at Oscar's plays again, Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, and I noticed that in his world, tragedy and comedy are constantly interweaving and cycling back into each other. They can't be detached. They're cousins.
Yeah.
And with that, I thought I got the idea of working against the grain of the sadness, the tragedy of the story, by turning it into an Oscar Wilde high comedy manners that then descends at time into the sadness of it, but keeps the tone light and fun at times. I mean, I feel like hopefully the reader is laughing, even in moments of great poignancy. So that was my goal, not to just dwell on the bathos, but find different registers.
Yeah, and I would say it actually would be easier. I think a much lesser writer and a much lesser book would have just gone hog wild with I'm going to get inside Oscar's mind and have the audacity to present. There's such a respectful distance and there's such an empathetic human rendering. The compliment I really want to pay you, Lou, is that Oscar emerges intact from any cheap shots or kind of retroactive psychoanalyzing, and
Mm-hmm.
in a way, not only becomes more human, we really feel the tragedy of the decisions he made, the life he lived, the times he lived in, and again, this humanizing effect. I think that what I'm hearing from you and what I got from the book was your entryway as a writer was this genuine human empathy for the lives impacted. So it's not
Yeah.
right that we see a biography or a movie about Oscar and his family is, tertiary and uninvolved when the reality is in the good, bad, and ugly ways, the family lived with him, loved him, and dealt with
Yeah.
that pretty, in some cases, longer aftermath,
Mm-hmm.
in not great ways. But I think the artistic choices you make um, approach these heady topics and heady figures with such a respect. I maybe that's one of the reasons your writing works so well for me and so many others. I think the easier way in and a more immature writer would just go to town and I think there's a disrespect and lack of craft involved in that kind of
Mm.
fantasy type writing.
Oh, that thank you for that. In my mind, this was always the story of a family that is torn apart but wants to be reunited, and that's historically accurate. One of the first things Oscar did when he left Reading jail, where he had been, of course, in prison for acts of gross indecency,
Yeah.
was to write a letter to Constance and to ask her to send photographs of the boys. So he never stopped being a father in his head, and the boys themselves wanted to be reunited with him. Decades later, the sole surviving family member, Vivian Holland, they changed their names to Holland, wrote a memoir. This 1952, I think it came out, called "Son of Oscar Wilde," with his face on the cover. So that was his way of outing himself in a way. But one of the things that comes out from reading that memoir is how devoted he was to his father. Decades later, he has warm memories of Oscar crawling around on the nursery floor and pretending to be a horse or something. And
Right.
so they were all very close, and so for me, it's a family saga, if you will.
Yep. And I've asked you this before, but it applies because you do this in your books. I mean, the incredible amount of research and the fidelity to the historical record. Like I said, you, of course, on some levels, aesthetically, you're taking some liberties, but you really endeavor to be faithful to the historical record and a genuine rendering, which again is the difference between an excellent writer and a pretty good writer. The attention to detail, the sense the reader gets of the times in which the actions being depicted. Talk a little bit about your research and how it was on this book.
Sure.
Again, I marvel at the fact that this clearly is also part of what makes you tick. Part of your style is you like to roll up your proverbial sleeves and get into the I'm going to enter this world and learn as much about it as I can.
Oh yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's a full body immersion for me. I just dive into the literature of that period. Obviously, I read a lot of Oscar Wilde,
Yeah.
but also contemporary writers, early Shaw. Who else was I looking at? Maybe some Bram Stoker. And what I do, it's this, I'm literally sort of underlining things as I read. It's that not low tech. It could be an idiom, or it could be a detail, or it could be just something that resonates with the period. And I dutifully note it down. I've got these Word files. So I've got a lot of stuff about everything. But
Yeah.
what I find is at some point in the writing of it, I find that I have to let go of the research to a certain extent and trust that it's still coming through. Because the historical novels that I don't enjoy reading are the ones that are just battened down with the author's research. They want you to know how much work they've done, and they're
Yes.
just larding it with this unnecessary stuff that is slowing down the story, getting in the way of the story. So to me, the story takes over and takes precedence over anything else. So anything that's getting in the way of that, has to go. So I'm kind of rigorous about that. To me, it's all. I'm glad you're about the story, because I am too. I consider myself a storyteller before anything else. And to me, it's all about the story. Tell the story the best you can. So,
Yeah, and as usual, you're being very modest, but I think what I'm one way of interpreting what you just said is it's kind of like the notion of practice or improvising. If you're a musician, jazz musician in particular, you put in all the time so that when you're in the moment, the imagination, the spontaneity can take over. I'm assuming in this
that's a great
case
way.
you're getting into the story, and clearly there's this beautiful tension between your imagination, the story that you feel is emerging and that needs to be told, but it wouldn't happen without, or I shouldn't say wouldn't, right? But it couldn't happen with that authenticity without a lot of the homework being done. And the reason I want to emphasize that is I think writers or younger writers watching and tuning in and trying to figure out how does this all work? Like there are no shortcuts. Sometimes any writer will talk about those moments of inspiration where you feel like you're channeling, and those are the moments we live for. But you've got to put in the time and know your subject. And again, I think that doesn't just come from your desire to write well, but it's just deep respect for the subject matter, which someone like Oscar Wilde, it would be a travesty for a writer to take those liberties and not treat that with sufficient kind of, a kind of a dutiful sense of honor.
Yeah. I mean, those are great points. To me, should I add, the research is also an idea generator. I learn things through research that then help inform the story.
Yeah.
There's a sequence, there's an act set in World War One, and I read a wonderful memoir by Robert Graves called Goodbye to All That, which is an incredible depiction of what it was like to live behind the lines. In World War One for a British soldier. So and I learned things from that about how and so you definitely, the research definitely informs that stuff.
Right. And that was my next question. I wrote, I couldn't wait. This is very unusual. Well, whatever, it's not unusual, but I couldn't even wait for this. I had to send you a note while I was reading, without giving anything away. But yeah, the World War One sequence, I'll just say, and I'm going to write about this also, but astonishing tour de force. And I was curious. You kind of just answered it. I was curious, you had to deal with it because one of the characters had experience there. So
Mhm.
on a basic level, duh. But how much of the research informed? I was just, again, without giving anything away, I was truly like bowled over by the verisimilitude. It wasn't just an accurate depiction historically of kind of these circumstances, but the mental strain. There's a lot going on in a very short section. So I just want to say, unbelievable writing. But talk a little bit about how you pulled that together.
Well, thank you, Sean. Well, again, that was a lot of research. That was probably the shortest section in the whole book, but it was probably the hardest to pull off. I've never written about war before. I've never written that kind of straight guy stuff um, before. Of course, they're not necessarily the straight guys in this scene, but
Yeah.
um, so that was intimidating. But again, it's just diving in and into these accounts. Another influence on that was a play I don't think it gets revived anymore. They made a film of it recently. It's called Journey's End by R.C. Sheriff, and it's just about these British soldiers uh, behind the lines, just waiting, all waiting to die. And it gets at the fatalism of it, the black humor of it, but also the toll it takes on their psyches. And yeah, so there again, World War One's has been pretty well documented. There have been wonderful poets, as you know, Siegfried
Yeah.
Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, and Pat Barker, of course, did her trilogy, I think, around that time. Yeah, and so there's a lot of good stuff about it. So actually, the challenge is sometimes, okay, finding your own little corner of that world, just because it has been so documented. It had such a traumatic effect on entire generation of British men, and I think that trauma kind of rolled forward through time. So it's you can still feel the PTSD in some of their work.
Oh, for sure. For sure. In fact, the quote that I always like, especially, I was teaching a course last spring about the decades of the 20th century, and I always kind of relish reminding people that don't know that World War One wasn't called World War One. It
Yeah,
was
it was just the war.
the
It was the
Great
Great
War
Great
because they
War.
figured, which is that there's the whole history of humanity there, right? That, well, this is the war to end all wars. Well, first of course it wasn't, because we can never learn, but
Right.
the magnitude of what was happening was at such a different level
Oh
from
yeah.
what the world had seen before.
Because
And
the
yeah,
technology of destruction had gotten, more advanced, if you will. So they were killing each other in ways that just weren't possible even 30 years earlier. So
right. I'll before I move on, I'll also say there's something, maybe it's a happy accident, maybe it's, you had to you were juggling a lot of balls for the narrative, but to be able to succinctly render a scene from a big war, a big topic that volumes have been written about, to be able to do that in a short, well, to use a expression, the short, sharp shock of
I love
PTSD.
that.
Um,
That's Gilbert, right? Yeah.
that gives more, kind of poignancy and power. So I don't know if there's a question there so much as there's something to be said, I think, artistically, to go the other way and say, this is so juicy, I'm actually gonna pack a lot into a short
Yeah.
period of time, and the emotional effect of that. I know for me, I actually kind of had to put the book down and sit with that for a while.
Oh wow, that's lovely to hear. Yeah, actually, it's funny, that very first chapter was about twice its length originally, and I went through it and it felt draggy because I was trying to get in all this, again, the research. Look what I learned about geopolitics and la la la. Aren't I smart and clever? But then I realized, I think we already know that stuff. We already know a lot of stuff about combat in these days. So again, it was just a matter, what do I need? What will advance the story, and what won't? And so in that first chapter, I think it was whittled down to half because it was just too slow. It wasn't getting things underway. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I can ask two questions in one, which is, again, a reminder to everyone. If you have not seen, first of all, you have to read The Pale Blue Eye.
that's right.
If you're a Poe fan, I mean, ridiculous. But the fact that it was a number one global Netflix release starring Christian Bale, I want to see how all that's been going, but also I couldn't help, and I think all of your fans with all of your books are imagining it on the big screen, but there's a combination of hope, both because of the topic, how perfectly it's done, but there's this sense of maybe a new momentum, like, let's get down to Brad, like, who's going to play Oscar in the new movie.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit of, so if you
Oh.
will, talk a little bit about the lingering, profoundly positive
Oh.
impact of the Pale Blue Eye movie, and where we are. I know you can't give any secrets away, but like, just what has this done for you personally and professionally, in terms of, like, let's get some movies made from some of these.
Well, I would love that to happen. I mean, the movie did well, and certainly, so, which is great.
Yeah,
It's funny though, because even though I was a consultant on the script, which was nice of them to let me be.
yeah,
I In the end, I felt like, okay, this isn't this isn't mine. This is something of mine that they took and they made it into something of theirs. But it was great, and it had financial benefits, which are great. I fixed my roof. I got dining room chair. I'm sitting in one of my new dining room chairs that I bought with movie money, mailbox money, as my grandfather used to call it. And but I will say it didn't trigger a stampede of film producers, looking for the next Bayard movie. It appears to be a one-off. And through the years, I've had several books optioned, and I know you know what that means, but it all it means is someone takes your book and for a year and tries to make something happen. 99% of the time, nothing happens because so many things have to align for anything to happen. So for the fact that Pale Blue Eye even became a movie, it was statistically very unlikely. So I think it's even more unlikely that another one will become a movie, just because it's so hard to get these things off the ground. So that's a long way of saying that I don't spend a lot of time casting it in my head. Although if Emily Blunt decided she wanted to play Constance Wilde, I would be totally okay with that. And in fact, I have an agent who's always telling me this is not going to become a movie. This is not become a movie. So you really, until the Pale Blue Eye started actually shooting,
Yeah.
I was ready for it all to fall apart, because those things do fall apart all the time. So it's a weird business, even weirder than publishing. And so I try not to spend too much energy imagining a film version. But of course, if it happens, it would be great. But it's completely out of my hands, as you know.
Right. Well, I mean, so I guess the fanboy part of me is despite, knowing what I know from your experience, knowing what I know from industry experience in general, and hearing people talk about this, knowing the state of the industry. So as a fan, that's a little disappointing because, yeah, of course, I didn't think the floodgates had suddenly opened, although I
Yeah.
hope that they did.
Yeah.
Christian Bale, #1 Netflix, but
Right.
maybe that's a good entryway into the state of the industry. Doing what I do, I'm at least conversant and interested in the deluge of stories, and I would say we hope for bright spots, but it seems, speaking about the media at large, the literary world in general, like uh, most of the news is bad. So I wonder how much of what you just said is a reflection of no one's taking chances, or fewer people are taking chances. That's why we're seeing superhero part 10. It's understandable, but how do you feel about, I don't know, the state of the industry and what that says about the prospects of even a book that does well being optioned or being seen through?
You're talking about the state of the film industry?
Or the state of, yeah, just the state of the art. Like it
Yeah.
just seems like in a world where there's more opportunity in a lot of different weird ways, whether it's blogging and
Yeah.
people being able to control their own brand, it does still seem like an example like the Pale Blue Eye, it has not become the new normal, which I guess I'm saying part of me is surprised by that and disappointed
Hmm.
that we've seen it can work. Why isn't it happening more often?
That's a really good question. Gosh, I wish I had a more intelligent answer. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't really been analyzing this problem at a very deep
Yeah.
level, but a couple of things that come to mind. The film industry is now, as you say, dominated by franchises, right?
Yeah.
And it's geared toward, I would say, teenage boys largely. Obviously, a lot of adults enjoy those movies too, and I don't not enjoy them. But I'm grateful to the stream. I'm grateful to Netflix. I'm grateful to streaming services, because I do think they make a home for the adult kind of stories that movies used to tell us. We think, looking back to the 1970s, you had extraordinary works from Scorsese and Coppola and Roman Polanski, and people went to the movies to watch something adult, and those movies made a lot of money.
Yeah.
Godfather and Cabaret and Cuckoo's
Yeah.
Nest and movies like that. They made a lot of money.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely not what's happening now. So I guess the streaming services at least give another avenue for that. I mean,
Right.
the downside is they're just so damn there's just so damn much content now,
Right.
that it's hard for anything to stand out. Uh,
Yeah.
but I think that's about the length of anything cogent I have to say on the subject. But it's a frustration as a consumer. There
Right.
are books that I read them. I just read James by Percival Everett. It's like I just so want that to become a film, with a great black actor in the lead. Maybe
Yes.
it will because it's done so well and been gotten
Right.
awards and stuff like that. But
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, you just articulated much more clearly what I was getting at, which is it's where it's this perverse. There is more content, and that's all to the good
right.
in the objective sense of there are more channels for distribution and the creation, and yet one would think that that's opening up a lot of possibilities. But I guess just the sad reality of the world that you and I live in, not only the artistic world, but literary fiction, movies that are not blockbusters by design.
Right.
It maybe has always been thus, and it's just always difficult to find financing and people with the kind of courage and the area you point out, right? I think there have been books written about the 70s,
Sure.
arguably were kind of this golden era of American cinema that maybe will never be duplicated because that was the time where, for once, the money aligned with the artistry.
Yeah.
It's
And,
difficult to sustain that.
and maybe the counterculture was partly responsible for that because the film industry figured out, oh, wait, there's a young audience that wants to see something different, wants to see adult themes, wants to see something, um, I don't know. I mean, yes, you're right. It's been written about by much more informed people than me, and I try not to romanticize any decade because there was a lot of shitty movies in the 70s too, right? And a
Right.
lot of shitty TV, I should add. I know
Yeah.
because I watched it all. There was nothing else to watch. There were three fucking networks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, $6 million man. Okay, let's go. That's
Right.
what we got tonight. Let's do it.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah, well, and I think that's why people, our generation has now become the obligatory tiresome next generation. But I think like Gen X and our relative, era, we all speak the same language culturally because there weren't that many choices. So I think that it'll be interesting to see how the aughts shake out in subsequent, works of art and criticism because there has been so much more disparate. I think it's going to be a much more multicultural, much more empathetic rendering, but
Much
also
more
maybe
fragmented, much more fragmented. I mean, think about the millions of people who's watched the final episode of MASH. That number will never be equal. It wasn't even equaled by Seinfeld because there will never be another time where all Americans gather around their TV at the same time to watch the same program. We will never have that again. So, and I don't know if that's a bad thing or a good thing. I don't know, but
yep. Yep. You had your moment. Yeah. I in the class I talked about, one of there were so many moments, as I'm sure you can imagine, where there was like this mic drop of surreal disbelief when I would just mention casual things that they couldn't comprehend. But the notion of you watched a certain show, and if you didn't see it, whether it was a sporting event or a movie,
mm,
you didn't see it. There was no TiVo, there was no
yeah,
VCR, there
yeah.
was no internet, and you see the scales start to fall. Like, well, you could watch it later. Like you watched it in real time, and that was the only time.
There might be a rerun later in the year.
Yeah,
That would be your only other shot. So.
yep, yep. So that sort of gets us to. I would be remiss if I didn't point out in my celebration of Lou that you also are a critic and a teacher. You definitely have a perspective or perspectives on how the literary world has changed or not since you first started writing. Like just I said earlier, and I tried to tee it up to you, but I appreciate you didn't necessarily take the bait. I do not think it's a bad time to be a writer. I'm just saying when I read about the industry from
Yeah.
insiders, there's a proliferation of bad news and not a lot of celebration. Do you
Yeah.
share that, or how is your perspective? Again, a critic, teacher, writer,
Mhm.
what has changed in the last couple of decades, or not?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is the consolidation of the publishing business into the big five. So when I started out, I was According to Mr. Lincoln was published by Algonquin, which at the time was an indie press, very well regarded, but small,
Yeah.
very much a mom and pop kind of shop. They put out maybe 12 titles a year,
Okay.
and so every title felt special, and I felt really um, loved and appreciated. It was just a wonderful experience. Then Algonquin and the larger corporation Workman was sold to Hachette, one of the big five,
Yeah.
and they were absorbed into there. And it was very clear that this mom and pop family store culture was not going to work in the larger corporate. So 3 years went by, and then just a few weeks ago, my editor was fired, my publicist was fired, the head of marketing left. So the publisher that has brought the people who birthed these last three books with me are all gone. And technically, I'm still part of Little Brown, but I don't know where I stand at all. So that's the second time I've been an orphaned author. So it's a weird business.
Yep.
I keep coming back to William Goldman's line about the movie industry, which is nobody knows anything. And that's my feeling about publishing. They're all running a little scared because they've been hearing for years that publishing is dying, and they're trying to keep it alive, and they're lunging, and they're sometimes getting very conservative, sometimes being a little crazy. So
Right.
I don't think anybody can really explain publishing to anybody at this point.
Right.
It's just a bunch of people just trying to sell as many books as they can, but they still don't know what works. And maybe that's kind of nice in the end, that you can pre-program a bestseller for sure. If it's a James Patterson book is always going to sell a lot of books. But a
Right.
new author coming along, or someone like me who's been chugging away for 25 years, it's always hard to tell from book to book what's going to work.
Right.
Um,
Well, so I appreciate that insight, and I think, you epitomize, I think you can help kind of demystify. I certainly over the decades have known and talked to and seen writers who, and I think this has been exacerbated by social media and kind of the
mm,
more business centric sensibility of America. Like, well, once I get to X, and I don't even just mean financially, but like once I hit this plateau, the vistas will open. And I do think, we talked about not romanticizing the past. I do think the life of a writer, professor, there was a middle class aspirational reality to that
mhm.
that probably doesn't exist anymore. But the other side of that we should never overlook is how many African American and women writers never
Right,
even got into the side door.
right.
So there's always, even when it was a better time for a writer to maybe make a living, it was necessarily excluding so many people. So there's at least a
Yeah.
chance of more diverse voices being heard now. But I do feel like the pathways to making a living as a writer we're seeing in real time are it's becoming more tenuous. And the situation at the publishing, you know, one might think, well, Big Five, at least there, we've got a certain amount of stability, and the reality is nothing is really stable.
Nothing is stable. Nothing is stable. It's funny you talk about diversity of voices. Disha Filia is a great example. Her book was published by University Press. Why? Because they couldn't get a single sort of New York publisher to take a chance on it.
Yeah.
And that speaks to gender. It speaks to race. It speaks to the fear-based decision making that goes on, not just among publishers, but agents when they decide which writers to take on. So it's it's just a tough business, which circles back to the gratitude part of it. The fact that I'm still in it, that I'm still that they still let me create things is surprising at some level, because as I said, I'm 60, I'm aging out. But I try to just be grateful for the opportunities that I do have, even while hoping and that others can have that opportunity too, because it's not my nobody's success excludes anybody else, from making a success in the end.
Well, that leads me to something that I wanted to make sure I fit in. I say this every time I talk to you. The notion of community, being a literary citizen. What does that mean? How does one do it? I can say, from a very genuine place, in addition to all the things we've talked about, your full plate, your productivity, you always find time to lift up other writers, be supportive, be encouraging. I want to acknowledge that. I want to thank you personally. Talk a little bit about in a world where everyone's a brand, and we do feel this insane pressure. And I have a tremendous empathy for all of our fellow creatives and just human beings that everyone has to be putting on their best self, and you're on camera all the time. But the authentic moments, being part of something where you're kind of looking outward, I think I would venture to say one of the things you figured out is, well, one way to not be obsessed with movies being made and my success and my reviews is to celebrate others. But you do epitomize, you personify um, what it takes to be a good literary citizen. Thank you for
Thank
that.
you.
And why is that important to you?
Well, I guess it gets back to, I hate to be a broken record. There's an illusion that nobody younger than us even appreciates.
Yeah.
But again, it is a form of gratitude because when I was coming up, there were authors who were just staggeringly generous to me and kind and helpful. So yeah, so part of that is paying back. But part of the community you talk about is just about going out into the world and doing events like yours, the ones you've organized, and meeting other writers and realizing we're all struggling in our own way. We all have challenges. Even people who are even established writers are struggling. I just talked to Alana Berry, I.S. Berry, whose very first book has been getting all these awards. She's terrific. But we're talking about Angie Kim too had an astoundingly successful first novel. How do you follow that up? What kind of expectation level does that create? What kind of pressure does that put on you for the second one?
Yeah.
So she's had an astounding debut, and now what? Publishing in effect asks now what. So I think it's nice that we have these events, and I know you curate them yourself, where we can all, as writers, come together and discuss these things, the problems, the challenges, the opportunities. Because I learn from other people a lot. I've learned a lot from Angie, just watching her. She amazes me because she's only in her second book, and she's already such a pro at doing all the stuff that you need to do to send a book into the world. So I try
Yeah.
to learn too from other writers.
Well, and there's a common theme, and I feel this comes up, well, maybe understandably in almost every conversation I have, but the one kind of the two big recurring themes I can, I have, there's documentary footage of Angie working on her second book is still very much in the glow of
Mhm.
Miracle Creek, and having that anxiety but putting one foot in front of the other and having to
Mhm.
get the work done, talking to you year after year, getting
Mhm.
the work done. So it's the key there is there are no hacks, there are no shortcuts. You have to get the
Yeah.
work done, but more perhaps importantly, if at whatever age you're at, but certainly when you're on the other side of 50 or 40, if you're not being fulfilled, if the work is not feeling like something you should be doing, you're probably not doing it for the right reasons.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Um, yeah, I don't know. You're right. I mean, I've had books that this is a different topic. This is, I've been asked about writer's block, and my answer is always that I can't afford writer's block. I gotta push it out. So
Yeah.
you find a way to make it work. The one time I've experienced writer's block is when the project wasn't right. It just wasn't right. It wasn't going to work. And you tuck it away in the drawer, the metaphorical drawer these days. In the old days, it was an actual drawer. There's I think a couple of books, but writing is such an isolated act, right? It's
Right.
intrinsically isolated. So, and that's why it's such a gift to be able to come out of your office, your warren, wherever you're working,
Yeah.
and be with people who are trying to do the same thing, because we're all working at it, and it's not easy, as you know. And
Right.
so helping hands and friends can be great with that. That sounds really banal,
It
but
actually doesn't though, because again, I feel like I'm at once. I don't want to overstate anything, but I also don't want to sell you short because you really are that guy. Like, I'll just tell you from having done what I do for a long time, there really are vanishingly few artists who are achieving at the highest levels, critically acclaimed, making a living, and are just good human beings. So it's something to always celebrate, and to hear you as always talk about why it's important to be a good human being. It also, I think, is an antidote for, and I think these are great conversations about the whole art monsters. That's talk about juicy topic for another conversation about does one have to become an asshole to be good? Of course not. But it's always good to be able to point to people and say, no, you really don't have to be all consumed and let other lives be ruined because of your obsessive, quest for greatness. So those are always things to point to in a world that I think cynicism is the default setting. These conversations are a great relief to that.
good.
But so speaking of, I have to assume, one never wants to assume, but when I talk to you, there's always something. Are you already either at work on the next thing, or are you chewing on some ideas, or are you taking some well-warranted time to recuperate?
No, I like work. I like my work. So I'm always trying to be working if I can. And I feel a sort of existential anxiety when I'm not working on something, which is right where I am. What happened is I've been working, kicking the tires of a nonfiction idea for the last 9 months and doing a lot of research around that. And it's not clear if that's going to be proceeding or not, partly because my publishing situation is so unsettled right now. So we're just trying to figure out what's next.
Right.
And so, but I have another idea kind of bubbling in the back. So hopefully within the next few months, I'll be moving forward, but I got nothing to report right now, which annoys me to know. I love to be able to say, yeah, I'm a third of the way through the next one because I do, as I said before, do have the sense of the clock ticking and I want to get moving. So it bugs the shit out of me when I have to be idled for however long, trying to
Right.
be a good sport
Right.
about it. But
Well, interesting that you say nonfiction, though. Just that alone, right? Showing some dexterity there. But again, as a wonderful critic, that's not a foreign world to you. But interesting just to hear that you're toying with a
yeah.
larger scale nonfiction project.
Yeah, because it really it was partly because the Wilds kicked the shit out of me a little bit. So I was kind of pretty tired after it was done in a good way. In a good
Yes.
way. I mean, I was feeling it the whole way, but it was a heavy lift. And so I thought maybe I'll just write a fun little nonfiction book. And then of course I came around to writing a nonfiction proposal, which for your listeners is not is also a heavy lift. Believe me, it is tens of thousands of words possibly, and it's hard. And you basically have to write the whole damn book
Right.
without writing it. So it wasn't easy at all. I don't know what I was thinking, and I have tremendous respect, even more respect for my nonfiction brethren and sistren for what they do because it's a lot.
Yeah.
When I do a novel, if I have an existing publisher, I'll write maybe 10,000 words. I'll cobble together some bogus synopsis because I don't necessarily know what's going to happen.
Right.
And here, is that enough? But not for a nonfiction book. So it's been an education, and I'm never too old to be educated about this work. So
Yeah, I think I think that's an interesting grace note, right? Like this notion of you of all people, there's uncertainty, there's a tenuous. I think that thank you for the insights into the state of the literary industry as such, that that there are no guarantees. Um, we always want to avoid, banality and cliche, but it's like the work is the important thing,
yeah,
the gratitude for being able to do the work, and
yeah,
the surrender of you do it as well as you can, and at a certain point, you do hope that other people appreciate it, and the book or the work finds its way into the world. And gosh, I think if you told us in our late teens, early 20s, like that's it, and we're sitting here older and wiser saying
that's
that's a
it.
pretty good place to be.
Yeah,
Maybe there's
the
something
work
we
is the
can do.
reward, and the work, as I said before, the work is the one thing you control. The work is the one thing that you have a say in. When I look at a book, as opposed to comparing it to the film industry, when I look at a book, I know that every word in that book is written by me at some point. Whereas a screenplay, my God, the things
Right.
that happen to a single screenplay, and how little of it may even get to the screen, if anything. You may be in the WGA courtroom trying to determine how much of that movie you wrote so you can get a little tiny credit on the screen. It's a very different world. So speaking of gratitude, the fact that I get to a full say over everything that goes into a book of mine, that's something that makes it powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's all in there, right? The whole riddle reduced to that. It's all the responsibility of creating it, but then all the pride, and being able to look at a year or more of one's
Yeah.
life and say, well, there's a tangible product. There's something kind of intoxicating and satisfying about
Yeah, for sure. This is what I've been doing. This is what I've been doing for the last couple of years.
it.
Here
Right.
it is. Yeah,
Right.
like it or not.
Well,
Mhm.
Lou, as always, so thank you. It's always a
Thanks, Sean.
joy to speak to you. It's a tremendous joy. I mean, of course, I would lie because I love you, but it's really makes my job so much easier to read a book from someone I know and say, God, I not only love it, I kind of hate him a little bit because I don't know how he does it. So
I love hearing that actually.
it's a true celebration. I wish you all the best as always. And if I can do my tiny modest part to expose newer readers, absolutely my pleasure, but also what a joy for the people about to discover your work. They're in for a treat. So we will check in again as we tend to do, but
Yeah.
um, again, you deserve all this, but I wish nothing but more of the same.
I'm so grateful to you, Sean, for letting people like me on, but also for all you do to promote literature and the word. It's wonderful stuff. So I appreciate you. I'm grateful for you. I will end
All
there.
right, well, to be continued, my friend, and we'll be waiting to hear some news on when this next project congeals and we can
You and
start.
me both. Yes, we will both be waiting on news. Yes.
All right, my friend.
Thank
Folks,
you,
thanks for
Sean.
tuning into Some Things Considered. Thanks for checking it out. To find out more, go to SeanMurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity, and we want to advocate for art by any means necessary. So drop us a line if you want to be a guest, recommend a guest, let me know. We want to continue to do the things we do. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at SeanMurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.